Good evening, traveler. Welcome back to this quiet corner of history, where the dust settles slowly and the hours stretch like shadows across stone walls. Tonight, as the world outside your window grows still and the familiar sounds of the day fade into memory, I invite you to journey with me to the most isolated places on earth, to towers of stone and iron that rise from jagged rocks, where the sea never rests and the wind speaks in tongues older than any language. Before we begin, I have a small request. If you are comfortable, leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. It brings me a quiet comfort to know that as I speak these words into the darkness, someone in Tokyo is drifting off as the rain taps against their window. Someone in Buenos Aires is watching the last light fade from their ceiling. Someone in a small village in Norway is pulling their blankets closer against the cold. We are all connected in this moment, scattered across time zones, but united in the simple act of seeking rest. Tonight, we will explore the life of the Victorian Lighthouse keeper, those solitary figures who spent their lives perched on the edge of civilization, keeping the flame alive so that ships might find safe passage through the darkness. You may have imagined their life as peaceful, perhaps even romantic, a quiet existence far from the troubles of the world. But I am here to tell you, with all the gentleness I can muster, that you would not have survived it. Not for the reasons you might expect, not because of the storms or the isolation alone, but because of the slow, grinding weight of days that stretched into weeks, that stretched into months, all measured by the turning of the light and the endless rhythm of the waves. So settle in, adjust your pillow, let your breathing slow. The lighthouse keeper's story is not one of adventure or excitement. It is a story of waiting, of watching, of small rituals repeated until they become the very fabric of existence. And in that repetition, in that crushing monotony, there is a strange kind of peace. Let us find it together. Asterisk, asterisk, in the year 1847, a man named Thomas Griffiths stood on the dock at Plymouth, England, watching a small boat being loaded with supplies. Barrels of oil, sacks of flour, coal wrapped in oilcloth, boxes of candles, and a single wooden trunk containing everything he owned in the world. He was 32 years old, a former sailor whose knees had begun to trouble him on the rolling decks of merchant vessels, and he had answered an advertisement in the Plymouth Herald seeking men of sober character and steady nerve to serve as lighthouse keepers on the remote stations of the English coast. The advertisement had promised a wage of £45 per year, quarters provided, and the satisfaction of serving a noble purpose. What it had not mentioned was the profound and terrible loneliness that awaited him, the months of isolation, punctuated only by the screaming of gulls and the crash of waves against stone, the slow erosion of his sense of self until he could no longer remember what his own voice sounded like when raised in conversation rather than muttered to himself in the long hours of the watch. But Thomas Griffiths did not know any of this as he stepped into that boat and was rowed out through the gray waters toward the tower that would become his home. He saw only the lighthouse itself, a column of white granite rising from a cluster of black rocks, its glass lantern room glinting in the pale afternoon light. It looked, he would later write in his journal, like a finger pointing toward heaven, or perhaps a monument to something he could not yet name. The lighthouse service of Victorian Britain was, in many ways, a refuge for men who had nowhere else to go. Former sailors whose bodies could no longer withstand the demands of life at sea. Veterans of distant wars who found the noise and bustle of cities unbearable. Widowers seeking escape from homes that had become tombs of memory. Men who had failed at other occupations and saw in the lighthouse a last chance at respectability. And yes, men who simply craved solitude, who found comfort in silence and space and the absence of human demand. Trinity House, the ancient corporation responsible for lighthouses around the coasts of England and Wales, was particular about the men it hired. Applicants were required to demonstrate literacy, for the keeping of logbooks was essential. They needed to show mechanical aptitude, for the maintenance of the light apparatus was complex and demanding. They were questioned about their drinking habits, their religious convictions, their ability to endure confinement. References were checked. Medical examinations were conducted. The service did not want men who would break, and yet men did break. The records of Trinity House, preserved in dusty archives, contain accounts of keepers who went mad in their towers, who saw things that were not there, who stopped keeping their logs and let the light go dark, who had to be removed by force and sent to asylums where they spent the remainder of their days, staring at walls and flinching at shadows. The lighthouse service learned, through bitter experience, that isolation could be as deadly as any storm. This is why, by the middle of the 19th century, most rock lighthouses were staffed by 3 keepers rather than 1 or 2. 3. Men who would live together in a space no larger than a modest cottage, sharing meals and duties and the endless hours of the watch. 3 men who might grow to love one another like brothers, or who might come to hate each other with a cold and patient fury that had nowhere to go and no way to express itself except through the subtle cruelties of confined living. Asterisk, asterisk, picture, if you will, the lighthouse tower itself. The great rock lights of the Victorian era were marvels of engineering, built to withstand the full fury of the Atlantic or the North Sea. They rose from rocks that were submerged at high tide, rocks that had claimed countless ships before the lights were built to warn them away. The towers were constructed of interlocking granite blocks, each one cut to fit precisely with its neighbors, the joints sealed with a mortar that would harden to something stronger than the stone itself. The famous Eddystone Lighthouse, standing on a reef 14 miles off the coast of Plymouth, was the most celebrated of these structures. The current tower, built by James Douglas and completed in 1882, rises 133 feet from its foundation and weighs more than 4,000 tons. Its walls are solid granite, nearly 9 feet thick at the base, tapering as they rise. It was designed to be struck by waves, to let them break against its curved surface and fall away without finding purchase. Inside the tower, space was precious. The lower levels contained the oil stores, the coal store, the water tanks. Above, these were the living quarters, typically 2 or 3 small rooms stacked one above the other, connected by a spiral staircase that wound up through the center of the tower like a corkscrew through a bottle of wine. The rooms were circular, following the shape of the tower, with walls that curved inward as they rose. The windows were small and thick, set deep in the stone to resist the force of the waves. The keepers slept in bunks built into the walls, narrow and coffin-like, with curtains that could be drawn for the illusion of privacy. They cooked on a small stove that burned coal or coke in a kitchen barely large enough for one man to stand and work. They ate at a table that folded down from the wall when needed and folded up again when not. Every inch of space was accounted for. Every object had its place, and woe to the keeper who left anything where it did not belong. Above the living quarters was the service room, where the weights and clockwork mechanism that turned the light were housed. And above that, at the very top of the tower, was the lantern room, a cage of glass and metal that held the light itself. This was the sacred space, the reason for the tower's existence, and the keepers treated it with a reverence that bordered on the religious. The glass was polished daily until it gleamed. The brass fittings were buffed until they shone like gold. The lens, that magnificent assembly of prisms and lenses that focused the light into a beam visible for 20 miles or more, was cleaned with the gentlest touch, for even a fingerprint could diminish its power dot in this tower. In this space, 3 men would live for weeks or months at a time. They would wake together, eat together, work together, sleep within a few feet of one another. They would hear each other's breathing in the night, smell each other's cooking, know the rhythm of each other's footsteps on the iron stairs. There was no privacy, no solitude within the solitude, just the 3 of them, and the light, and the sea. Let us follow Thomas Griffiths through a single day at his lighthouse. A day in late autumn, when the storms have not yet arrived, but the light fades early, and the nights stretch long. It is a day like any other day, which is to say, a day defined entirely by routine, by tasks performed in the same order at the same times, by rhythms that never vary, because variation is the enemy of survival. He wakes before dawn, as he has woken every day for the past 7 years. The bunk is warm, and for a moment he lies still, listening to the sounds of the tower. The wind is steady from the northwest, strong enough to make the structure sway. Almost imperceptibly, a motion so subtle that visitors never notice it, but that keepers feel in their bones after years of living with it. Below, he can hear one of his colleagues already moving about, the soft clank of the stove being opened, the scrape of coal being shoveled. Thomas swings his legs over the side of the bunk and plants his feet on the cold stone floor. He dresses quickly in the dim light, pulling on trousers and shirt, and the heavy woolen jersey that serves as both uniform and armor against the chill. His movements are automatic, requiring no thought. He has dressed in this room, in this order, thousands of times before. The buttons find their holes without his fingers needing to search for them. Breakfast is porridge, as it is every morning. The 3 keepers eat in near silence, exchanging only the briefest of words about the weather, the state of the sea, the tasks that lie ahead. They have learned, through long experience, that conversation must be rationed. There are only so many things to say, only so many stories to tell, and the supply must last. To exhaust the possibilities of talk too early in a posting is to condemn oneself to weeks of silence. And silence, complete and unbroken, is harder to bear than storms. After breakfast, Thomas climbs the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The light is still burning, though the wick has been turned low for the dawn, and his first task is to extinguish it. He does this carefully, almost tenderly, reducing the flame by degrees until it gutters and dies. Then he begins the work of maintenance. A glass of the lantern must be cleaned, inside and out. The lens must be inspected for any speck of dust or film of condensation. The mechanism that turns the lens must be checked, oiled, adjusted if necessary. The oil reservoirs must be measured and the consumption recorded in the log. This work takes most of the morning. Thomas moves through it with the efficiency of long practice, his hands finding tools and fittings without his eyes needing to guide them. He polishes brass until his reflection stares back at him from the metal, a face grown older than he remembers, lined by wind and salt and the strange stresses of a life lived in a tower. He cleans glass until it becomes invisible, until the only proof of its existence is the slight resistance it offers to his cloth dot by noon. The lantern room is immaculate, ready for another night of service. Thomas descends to the kitchen, where his colleagues have prepared the midday meal, salt beef and potatoes boiled in the same pot, bread baked 2 weeks ago and growing stale at the edges. They eat slowly, making the meal last, because eating is something to do, something that marks the passage of time in a place where time otherwise seems to stand still. The afternoon brings other tasks. There is always painting to be done, the endless battle against rust and salt corrosion. There are ropes to be spliced, equipment to be repaired, stores to be inventoried. Thomas spends 2 hours painting the railing that circles the gallery outside the lantern room, applying white paint over white paint, a coat indistinguishable from the dozen coats beneath it. The work is tedious, repetitive, numbing, exactly what is needed to fill the hours until darkness falls, and the light must be lit again out at 4 in the afternoon. Thomas takes his turn at the watch. He sits in the service room, just below the lantern, and looks out through the window at the sea. His job is to watch for ships in distress, for unusual weather, for anything that might require action or recording in the log. In practice, there is rarely anything to see but water and sky, the line where they meet shifting with the light and the weather, but otherwise unchanging. He watches anyway, because watching is his duty, because the one time he fails to watch might be the one time watching matters dot as the sun sinks toward the horizon. Thomas climbs once more to the lantern room. He checks the oil level, trims the wick, ensures that everything is ready. And then, as the last light fades from the sky and the first stars appear above the eastern horizon, he strikes a match and touches it to the wick. The flame catches, grows, fills the lens with golden light. He adjusts the mechanism that will turn the lens through the night, sets it in motion, and watches as the beam sweeps out over the dark water for the first time. This is the moment, repeated every evening for years beyond counting, that gives his life meaning. The light is alive. The ships at sea can see it. Sailors are setting their courses by its beam, trusting their lives to the flame that Thomas has kindled and will tend through the long hours ahead. In this moment, his isolation has purpose. His loneliness has value. He is a keeper of the light, and the light is burning. Asterisk, asterisk, in the ordinary world, time is marked by the events that fill it. The morning commute, the afternoon meeting, the evening meal with family. Days are distinguished from one another by the variations in routine, by the unexpected visitors, by the news that arrives from the wider world. Even in the quietest life, there are enough small differences from one day to the next to create the sense that time is moving, that life is progressing, that change is occurring even if imperceptibly. At the lighthouse, this is not so. Days do not distinguish themselves. They blur together into weeks, and weeks into months, and the only reliable markers of time's passage are the changing of the seasons and the high, arrival and departure of the relief boat. A keeper might wake one morning unable to say with certainty whether it is Tuesday or Thursday, whether he has been on the rock for 3 weeks or 4, whether the storm he remembers happened last night or last week. But lighthouse service understood this danger and required its keepers to maintain detailed logs. Every day, at prescribed hours, the keepers were to record the weather, the state of the sea, the visibility, the consumption of oil and other stores, any ship sighted, any unusual occurrences. These entries were to be made in a precise format, with no variation in language or style. The logs served multiple purposes. They provided data for meteorological studies. They documented the performance of the light. They created a record that could be consulted if questions arose. But perhaps most importantly, they forced the keepers to notice the passage of time, to mark each day as distinct from the ones before and after. Thomas Griffiths kept his log faithfully. Every 4 hours, day and night, he recorded his observations in the heavy leather-bound book that sat on the desk in the service room. His handwriting was neat and careful, the product of the elementary education he had received in the village school of his childhood and the years of practice that followed. The entries were brief, factual, devoid of emotion or opinion. October 15th, 1853, 8 a.m. Wind NW. Strong breeze. Sea moderate. Visibility good. Light extinguished 6:42 a.m. Oil consumption 4.2 pints. No ships sighted during night watch. Barometer 29. 8 falling. October 15th, 1853. 12 p.m. Wind NW. Fresh gale. Sea rough. Visibility moderate. Haze on horizon. Painted gallery railing, northwest section. Repaired leak in oil tank, section 3. One vessel sighted. Brig, heading southwest, approximately 8 miles distant. October 15th, 1853. 4 p.m. Wind NW, strong gale. Sea very rough. Visibility poor. Rain squalls. Secured all external equipment in anticipation of increasing weather. Light prepared for evening. One vessel sighted, steamer, heading northeast, approximately 12 miles distant. October 15th, 1853. 8 p.m. Wind NW, storm force. Sea high. Visibility nil. Light burning well. Heavy rain continuing. No vessels sighted. All keepers present and in good health. Reading through these logs, preserved in archives a century and more later, one is struck by the sameness of them. Day after day, month after month, year after year, the same observations recorded in the same format, the same tasks performed, the same weather patterns cycling through their eternal variations. And yet, within this sameness, there are moments that stand out, entries that break the pattern just enough to suggest the humanity behind the careful handwriting. December 25th, 1855, 8 a.m. Wind E, light breeze, sea calm, visibility excellent. Christmas Day, plum pudding served at noon, prepared by principal keeper from stores sent by shore station. Toasted absent families. Light burns, those 3 words. Toasted absent families contain worlds of loneliness and longing. On this day, when people throughout Britain were gathering with loved ones, exchanging gifts, singing carols, eating together in warm kitchens, the keepers of the lighthouse were raising their cups to empty chairs, To wives and children and parents they would not see for weeks or months to come. The entry is matter of fact, as all entries were required to be, but the emotion bleeds through, despite the constraints of form. You might imagine that a lighthouse would be a quiet place, far from the noise of civilization. In a sense, this is true. There are no city sounds, no traffic, no voices of strangers, no machinery of industry. But the lighthouse is not silent. It is filled with sound, constant and inescapable. Sound that enters through the walls and the windows and the very stones of the tower until it becomes part of the keeper's consciousness. A presence as familiar as his own heartbeat. The dominant sound is the sea. On calm days, when the water lies flat and silver under the sky, the sea whispers. It laps against the rocks at the base of the tower with a soft, rhythmic sound, like a mother hushing a child to sleep. On rough days, when the wind drives swells in from the open ocean, the sea roars. It crashes against the tower with a force that shakes the entire structure, sending spray 100 feet into the air, filling the lantern room with the smell of salt. On storm days, the sea screams. It becomes a living thing, malevolent and hungry, battering the lighthouse with waves that hit with the force of falling buildings. Thomas Griffiths learned to read the sea by its sound. He could tell, without looking, whether the tide was rising or falling, whether the weather was improving or worsening, whether a storm was approaching or receding. He came to know the different voices of the water, the way certain patterns of rock created certain patterns of sound, the way the wind from different quarters changed the pitch and rhythm of the waves. After years of listening, the sea became a language, and he became fluent in it. Above the sound of the sea, there was the sound of the wind. The tower stood exposed to every breath of air that moved across the ocean, and the wind found every crack and crevice in the stone, every gap in the windows, every space where the iron fittings met the granite. It moaned and whistled and howled, a chorus of different notes depending on its strength and direction. In calm weather, the wind sang softly, almost musically. In storms, it shrieked with a sound like tearing cloth, like the screams of the damned dot. And then there were the birds. Seabirds made their homes on and around the lighthouse, nesting in the crevices of the rock, perching on the gallery railing, circling the lantern room at night when the light drew insects and the insects drew the birds. Their calls were constant, a background chorus of screams and cries and mutterings that continued day and night. On foggy nights, when the light was especially bright in the thick air, birds sometimes flew into the lantern room glass, stunning or killing themselves against the panes. Thomas had learned to ignore the soft thumps in the darkness, the sound of wings against glass, the brief silence that followed. Inside the tower, there were mechanical sounds. The clockwork mechanism that turned the lens made a steady ticking, like a giant clock counting the seconds of the night. The weights that drove the mechanism descended slowly through the tower, requiring regular winding, and their movement produced a soft grinding sound that became the heartbeat of the light. The oil lamp itself made small sounds as it burned, the hiss of the flame, the occasional crackle as the wick needed trimming. These sounds were comforting in their regularity, proof that the light was burning, that the mechanism was functioning, that all was well. What there was not, what was notable by its absence, was human sound. The voices of the keepers were the only human sounds in this world, and they were used sparingly. Silence became normal. Conversation became an event. Thomas might go days without speaking more than a few dozen words. And those words were practical rather than personal. Pass the salt. Your watch begins at midnight. The barometer is falling. In this silence, the sounds of nature and machinery grew louder, more present, more real than they would ever be in a world filled with human noise. Everything at the lighthouse tasted of salt. The air tasted of it, heavy and mineral on the tongue. The water in the tanks, collected from rainfall and stored for drinking, carried a faint briny edge, despite the keeper's efforts to keep salt spray from contaminating the supply. The food, even the food that arrived fresh from the supply ship, soon acquired a salty patina from the air and the handling, and the general pervasiveness of the sea. The diet of a lighthouse keeper was limited by necessity. Fresh food could only be obtained when the supply ship visited, typically once a month in summer, and less frequently in winter, when storms made the passage dangerous. The staples were those that kept well: salt beef and salt pork, hardtack biscuits, dried peas and beans, flour and oatmeal, tea and sugar and coffee. There were preserved items, pickled vegetables, canned fruits, jams and marmalades. And there were luxuries, carefully rationed: tobacco, spirits, chocolate. Thomas Griffiths and his colleagues took turns cooking, each man responsible for meals on certain days of the week. The cooking was simple, the same dishes repeated in the same rotation, the same flavors and textures cycling through the weeks. Monday might be salt beef stew, Tuesday boiled pork with peas, Wednesday fish if any had been caught, Thursday porridge and hardtack, Friday whatever remained of the week's provisions improvised into something edible. By the end of a posting, the men knew exactly what they would eat on any given day, and the predictability was both comforting and deadening. Fishing provided welcome variety. The rocks around the lighthouse teemed with fish, and on calm days, when it was safe to venture onto the landing platform, the keepers would drop lines into the water and bring up cod, pollock, wrasse, and other species. Fresh fish, fried in a pan with a little fat, was a delicacy compared to the salt-preserved proteins that made up the bulk of the diet. The men would eat slowly on fish days, savoring each bite, talking more than usual about the quality of the catch, the way the flesh flaked from the bones, the difference fresh food made to the spirit as well as the body. The arrival of the supply ship was an event of tremendous significance. Days before it was expected, the keepers would begin watching the horizon more intently, hoping for the glimpse of a sail or the smudge of smoke from a steamer. When the ship appeared, the mood in the lighthouse lifted perceptibly. There would be fresh bread, perhaps sent from the shore station. There would be newspapers, weeks old but new to the keepers. There would be letters from home, if letters had been written. And there would be the brief presence of other human beings, the crew of the ship, bringing news and faces and voices from the world beyond the rock. The transfer of supplies was a complex operation, dependent on weather and sea conditions. The ship would anchor as close to the lighthouse as safety allowed, and the stores would be loaded into small boats and rowed to the landing platform. On rough days, the platform might be underwater, and the supplies would have to be hauled up the side of the tower using a crane and pulley system. The keepers would work for hours, hoisting barrel after barrel, crate after crate, until everything was safely inside and the ship could depart. And then the ship would sail away, growing smaller against the horizon until it disappeared into the distance, And the keepers were alone again with their salt beef and their hardtack, and the taste of the sea in everything they consumed. Asterisk, asterisk, at the heart of every lighthouse was the lens, and the lens was a marvel. Before the 19th century, lighthouses relied on open fires, then candles, then oil lamps with metal reflectors to project their light across the water. These methods were inefficient, wasting most of the light's energy in directions where it was not needed, visible only a few miles at best, even in clear conditions. The revolution came from France, from a physicist named Augustin-Jean Fresnel, who in 1822 invented the lens that would bear his name and transform lighthouse technology forever. The Fresnel lens was a thing of profound beauty and ingenious design. Instead of a single curved piece of glass, which would have been impossibly heavy and prone to cracking, Fresnel conceived of a lens made from many smaller pieces, each cut and polished to a precise angle, arranged in concentric rings around the light source. The prisms in the center of the lens bent the light horizontally, sending it out in a beam toward the horizon. The prisms at the top and bottom of the lens bent the light that would otherwise escape upward or downward, redirecting it into the main beam. Together, these elements captured nearly all the light from the lamp and focused it into a beam of tremendous intensity. Fresnel lenses were classified by order, from first order, the largest and most powerful, to sixth order, the smallest. A first-order lens stood more than 8 feet tall and nearly 6 feet in diameter, a towering assembly of glass and brass that weighed several tons. These giants were used in the most important lighthouses, the ones marking major headlands and dangerous reefs where the range of visibility was critical. The lens at the Eddystone Light, for example, was a first-order apparatus, its beam visible on clear nights for more than 20 miles at sea. Thomas Griffiths had never seen anything so beautiful as the lens in his lighthouse. On days when the sun shone through the lantern-room windows, the prisms would catch the light and scatter it into rainbows, filling the room with fragments of color that danced across the walls and ceiling. He understood, in a way that went beyond his technical training, that this object was precious, irreplaceable, the result of craftsmanship so refined that it bordered on art. He treated the lens with reverence, touching it only when necessary, and then only with claws of the finest linen, speaking to it sometimes in the quiet hours of his watch, as if it could hear and understand. The lens was mounted on a pedestal that allowed it to rotate, and this rotation gave each lighthouse its characteristic flash pattern. Some lights were fixed, showing a steady beam that never varied. Others were flashing, the lens rotating so that the beam swept past a given point at regular intervals. Still others were occulting, the beam steady but periodically blocked to create a pattern of light and darkness. A mariner approaching the coast could identify a lighthouse by counting the seconds between flashes. Consulting the chart that listed the characteristics of every light in the region dot, a mechanism that turned the lens was a marvel of Victorian engineering. A set of weights suspended in the tower below the lantern room provided the power. As the weights descended slowly through the tower, they turned a series of gears and cogs that rotated the lens at a precise speed. The mechanism was similar to a giant clock, and like a clock, it required regular winding. Every few hours, depending on the design, the keeper would have to climb to the service room and turn a crank that raised the weights back to the top of their track, resetting the system for another period of operation. The light source itself was an oil lamp of special design. Early lighthouses burned whatever oil was available, often whale oil or vegetable oil. But by the mid-19th century, a petroleum-based product called colza oil had become standard. This oil burned with a bright, clean flame that produced relatively little smoke. Important in a lantern room where any soot on the lens would reduce the light's effectiveness. The lamp had multiple wicks, arranged in concentric rings to produce the maximum amount of light from the minimum amount of fuel. Air was drawn up through the center of the lamp and around its base, providing the oxygen needed for efficient combustion. The whole assembly was carefully calibrated, each wick trimmed to exactly the right length, the oil flowing at exactly the right rate, the air supply adjusted for the atmospheric conditions of the moment. Maintaining the lamp was the most critical of the keeper's duties. Every evening, before the light was lit, the wicks had to be inspected and trimmed. Too long, and they would smoke, coating the lens with soot. Too short, and the flame would be dim, the beam weak, the light potentially invisible to ships that needed to see it. The oil reservoirs had to be filled, carefully, without spilling, the levels checked against the marks that indicated proper operation. The air passages had to be clear, unobstructed by debris or the bodies of insects attracted to the warmth dot once the light was burning. It required constant attention. Throughout the night, at intervals prescribed by regulation, the keeper on watch would climb to the lantern room and check the flame. He would adjust the wicks if needed, add oil if the level was dropping, clean any soot that had accumulated on the glass chimney that surrounded the flame. He would wind the mechanism that turned the lens, check the operation of the clockwork, ensure that the beam was sweeping the horizon as it should. This routine continued throughout the night. Every night, regardless of weather or fatigue or the state of the keeper's health. There could be no excuses, no lapses, no moments when the light was allowed to fail. Ships were depending on it. Sailors were trusting their lives to its beam. A single night of darkness could mean lives lost, ships wrecked, families destroyed. The weight of this responsibility pressed on the keepers constantly, a burden they carried in addition to all the other burdens of their isolated existence. Thomas Griffiths had seen what happened when lights failed. In his early years of service, before he came to the Rock Lighthouse, he had worked at a shore station where the light went dark during a storm because the keeper on duty had fallen asleep. By morning, the wreckage of a fishing boat was scattered across the rocks below the tower, and the bodies of 3 men were being recovered from the surf. Thomas had helped carry those bodies to the cart that would take them to the village, had seen the faces of the widows when they learned what had happened, had carried the memory of that day with him ever since as a reminder of what his duty meant. Light alone was not enough. On foggy nights, when the air was thick with moisture and the beam could not penetrate more than a few hundred yards, ships needed another way to find their position. This was the purpose of the fog signal, a device designed to produce a sound loud enough to carry across the water and distinctive, enough to identify the lighthouse from which it came. Early fog signals were crude. Bells were rung, guns were fired, explosive charges were detonated at regular intervals. These methods were labor-intensive and inconsistent, dependent on the keeper's ability to maintain the rhythm of the signal through hours of fog-shrouded darkness. By the mid-19th century, mechanical fog signals had been developed, powered by steam or compressed air, capable of producing sounds that could be heard for miles. The fog signal at Thomas Griffith's lighthouse was a siren, a device that produced its sound by forcing compressed air through a rotating disc with holes cut in it. When the disc turned and the air passed through the holes, the result was a rising and falling tone, eerie and mournful, that cut through the fog like a blade through cloth. The sound could be heard 10 miles away on a still night, and it became one of the most distinctive features of that stretch of coast. A landmark of sound, as the light was a landmark of vision. Operating the fog signal was exhausting work. The compressor that provided the air was powered by a steam engine, and the steam engine required constant feeding with coal. When fog closed in, one of the keepers would descend to the engine room at the base of the tower and begin shoveling. Coal into the furnace, water into the boiler, until the pressure built to the level needed to drive the compressor. Then the signal would begin, its cry going out across the water every 30 seconds, every 60 seconds. Whatever interval had been assigned to that particular light, the fog could last for hours, for days. Thomas had once worked the signal for 48 hours straight, spelling his colleagues in shifts of 4 hours on, 4 hours off, the sound of the siren becoming so embedded in his consciousness that he heard it even when he slept, dreaming of fog and darkness and the endless need to keep the sound going. His arms ached from shoveling coal, his ears rang from the proximity to the signal, his eyes burned from the smoke and the lack of sleep. But the signal continued, and somewhere out in the gray murk, ships heard it and adjusted their courses, and no one died. When the fog lifted at last, the silence was startling. Thomas would stand in the lantern room, looking out at the suddenly visible sea, the water stretching away to a horizon that had not existed for days. The absence of the fog signal seemed louder than its presence, a ringing emptiness that took hours to fade from his consciousness. And then, exhausted beyond measure, he would sleep, and the routine of the lighthouse would resume, and the fog would come again in its own time, and the signal would cry out once more into the darkness. Asterisk. The great storms came without warning in those days, before weather forecasting. One day the sea would be calm, the sky clear, the barometer steady. The next day, or the next hour, the world would change. The air would grow heavy and still. The birds would disappear from the rocks, seeking shelter in places known only to them. The barometer would begin to fall, slowly at first, then faster, the mercury dropping like a stone through water. And on the horizon, a line of darkness would appear, a wall of cloud and wind and rain advancing across the ocean like an army on the march. Thomas Griffiths learned to read these signs, but the reading gave him little comfort. To know that a storm was coming was not to escape it. The lighthouse was fixed in place, bolted to its rock, unable to flee the approaching violence. The keepers could only prepare, securing loose equipment, checking the integrity of windows and doors, ensuring that the lamp and lens were ready for whatever the night would bring. And then they would wait, watching the storm approach, feeling the first tentative gusts of wind, hearing the change in the voice of the sea from whisper to growl to roar. The worst storms came in winter, when the Atlantic generated waves of terrifying size and power. These waves did not simply crash against the lighthouse. They engulfed it. They rose up the side of the tower like living things, climbing the granite walls, hammering against the windows, sending spray over the lantern room itself, more than 100 feet above the sea. The keepers could feel the tower shake with each impact, could hear the groan of stone against stone as the structure absorbed forces that would have destroyed any ordinary building. During one such storm in the winter of 1852, Thomas experienced what he would later describe as the longest night of his life. The waves had been building for hours, driven by a wind that the anemometer recorded at more than 90 miles per hour before the instrument failed. By nightfall, the sea was white with foam, invisible in the darkness, except when lightning flashed and revealed the chaos below. The lighthouse stood in the center of a maelstrom, waves breaking against it from every direction, the spray reaching heights that should have been impossible dot at some point in that night. A wave struck the tower with a force that dislodged several stones from the gallery railing. The stones fell into the sea, taking part of the railing with them, leaving a gap through which a man could easily fall. Thomas did not learn of this damage until morning. He had been in the lantern room at the time, tending the lamp, and had felt only a particularly violent shudder, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others the tower had absorbed that night. The light never went out. Through all of that terrible night, through waves that rose higher than the tower itself, through wind that screamed with a voice like the end of the world, the light burned. Thomas trimmed the wicks and wound the mechanism and cleaned the soot from the glass chimney, performing his duties by habit when thought was impossible. He did not know if any ships were out in that storm, if anyone could see the light through the spray and the darkness. It did not matter. The light was his charge. Penny kept it burning dot by morning. The storm had passed, moving northeast toward other coasts, other tragedies. The sea was still rough, but the worst of the violence was over. Thomas climbed to the gallery to survey the damage and found the gap in the railing, the displaced stones lying somewhere on the seabed below. He found other damage too, a cracked window in the service room, a section of paint stripped from the tower's exterior, debris from unknown sources wedged into every crevice of the rock. The lighthouse had survived, but it bore the scars of its survival. Asterisk water has weight. This is a fact that anyone can understand in the abstract, but the lighthouse keepers understood it in a way that went beyond abstraction. They felt the weight of water every time a wave struck the tower. They heard it in the impact, a sound like a giant fist striking stone. They saw it in the way the granite walls, 9 feet thick at the base, could be shaken by the force of the sea. A cubic meter of seawater weighs approximately 1 ton. A wave striking the lighthouse might contain thousands of cubic meters, tens of thousands of tons, moving at speeds of 50 or 60 miles per hour. The force of such an impact was measured in the millions of pounds per square foot. Engineers had calculated these figures, had designed the towers to withstand them, but the calculations were cold and theoretical. The reality was a violence that defied comprehension. The keepers lived with this violence. They slept while waves struck the tower, waking only when a particularly severe impact shook the entire structure. They ate their meals to the accompaniment of the sea's assault, the crash and roar becoming background noise like traffic in a city. They climbed the spiral staircase while the tower swayed around them, their hands gripping the railing not for support, but for reassurance, for the comfort of holding something solid in a world that had become liquid. Thomas Griffiths developed a technique for sleeping during storms. He would wedge himself into his bunk, using rolled blankets to hold himself in place, and focus his mind on the rhythm of the waves rather than their force. The impacts came at intervals, he told himself, regular intervals, like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the ticking of a clock. If he could match his breathing to the waves, if he could let the rhythm carry him, he could find a kind of peace in the violence, a stillness at the center of the storm. This technique did not always work. Some nights, the waves were too fierce, too irregular, too laden with meaning and menace. Some nights, Thomas lay awake in his bunk, staring at the curved ceiling above him, feeling each impact as a threat to his life, calculating the odds that this would be the wave that finally breached the tower, that finally found the weakness in the stone, that finally ended everything. On these nights, morning came slowly, and when it came, Thomas was exhausted in body and spirit, drained by fear more than by any physical exertion. But morning always came. The storm always passed. The tower always stood. This was the lesson that the lighthouse taught its keepers, repeated in every storm, reinforced by every dawn. That stone was stronger than water. That light was stronger than darkness. That the patience of those who tended the flame was stronger than any force the sea could muster. It was a lesson that took years to learn, and once learned, could never be forgotten. After every major storm, the keepers would venture outside to assess the damage. This was dangerous work, often performed while the sea was still rough, and waves still washed over the rocks at irregular intervals. The men would tie ropes around their waists, anchoring themselves to the tower, and make their way around the base of the structure, checking for cracks in the foundation, for stones dislodged from the walls, for any sign that the storm had compromised the integrity of their home. The debris was always extraordinary. The sea would deposit all manner of objects on and around the lighthouse, things washed from the decks of ships, things torn from the shore, things whose origin could not be determined. Thomas once found half of a ship's wheel wedged into a crevice in the rock, the wood splintered by impact, the brass fittings green with age and salt. He once found a crate of oranges, sealed against the water, the fruit inside somehow still edible. He once found a child's doll, its painted face staring up at him from a tide pool, and he wondered for weeks after what had happened to the child who had owned it. Sometimes the debris included bodies. The sea gave up its dead reluctantly, but eventually, always, the bodies came. Drowned sailors, their faces bloated beyond recognition. Passengers from ships that had gone down in the storm, still wearing their Sunday clothes. Fishermen whose boats had been overwhelmed by waves too large to survive. The keepers would recover these bodies if they could, would wrap them in canvas and store them in the coolest part of the tower until the supply ship could take them away for proper burial. It was grim work, but it was work that needed to be done, and Thomas did it without complaint. The repairs after a storm could take weeks, months. The keepers were expected to handle minor damage themselves, filling cracks with mortar, replacing broken glass, repainting surfaces that had been stripped by wind and wave. Major damage required assistance from Trinity House, teams of workers brought out by ship to restore the tower to full function. In the meantime, the keepers continued their routine, tending the light, keeping the log, maintaining the vigilance that was the entire purpose of their existence. And always, somewhere beyond the horizon, another storm was forming. The sea was not satisfied with single assaults. It returned again and again, testing the lighthouse, probing for weakness, seeking the moment when stone would finally yield to water. The keepers knew this. They accepted it. They lived their lives in the intervals between storms, knowing that the next one was coming, knowing that their purpose was to be there when it arrived, to keep the light burning through whatever darkness the sea could summon. 14 miles. That was the distance from Thomas Griffith's lighthouse to the nearest point of land. A stretch of coast where fishing villages clung to cliffs, and the lights of houses could be seen on clear nights, tiny and yellow and impossibly distant. 14 miles of open water, of waves and wind and the cries of seabirds. 14 miles that might as well have been 14,000 for all the contact they allowed with the world beyond the rock. The Rock Lighthouse was the most isolated posting in the service. Shore lights, built on headlands and islands connected to the mainland, offered their keepers some contact with the outside world. Families could live nearby. Supplies could be obtained from local merchants. The keepers could walk on solid ground, could visit pubs and churches, could maintain some semblance of normal human life. But the Rock Light was different. The Rock Light was exile. Thomas had chosen this exile, as all the keepers had chosen it. He had known, when he applied for the posting, what it would mean. He had been told about the isolation, about the limited contact with family, about the months of confinement in a tower barely large enough to hold 3 men. He had nodded and said he understood, and in the moment he had believed himself. But understanding something in the abstract is different from living it in the flesh. The abstract does not wake you in the middle of the night with the realization that you have not touched another human being in 3 weeks. The abstract does not make your chest tight with a loneliness so profound that it feels like a physical illness. The rotation system was designed to mitigate this isolation. Each keeper was supposed to spend 2 months on the rock, followed by 1 month on shore. During the shore month, he would live at the depot, maintaining equipment, training new keepers, spending time with his family if he had one. The shore month was supposed to refresh him, to restore his connection with humanity, to prepare him for another stint on the rock. In practice, the rotation often failed. Storms could delay the relief boat for weeks, stretching a 2-month posting to 3 months or longer. Illnesses among the keepers could disrupt the schedule, requiring men to stay on the rock when they should have been on shore. Administrative failures, equipment shortages, and the general inefficiency of any large organization could all extend a posting beyond its intended length. Thomas once spent 4 consecutive months on the rock, waiting for a relief that was delayed again and again by weather and circumstance. By the time the boat finally arrived, he had forgotten what grass felt like under his feet. 3 men in a tower. This was the standard complement for a rock lighthouse, arrived at through decades of trial and error. 1 man alone was too vulnerable to accident and madness. 2 men could fall into conflicts that had no resolution, could come to hate each other in ways that poisoned the air they breathed. But 3 men formed a kind of society, a tiny community with its own dynamics and balances. When 2 men disagreed, the third could mediate. When 1 man fell ill, the other 2 could cover his duties. When the silence became too heavy, there was always someone to break it. The principal keeper was the senior man, responsible for the operation of the lighthouse and the conduct of his subordinates. He reported to the authorities at Trinity House, kept the official logs, and made decisions about maintenance and routine. The 2 assistant keepers followed his orders, performed the duties he assigned, and deferred to his judgment in matters of lighthouse management. This hierarchy was clear and unambiguous, essential in an environment where confusion could be fatal. But hierarchy could not govern everything. The three men shared meals, shared quarters, shared the long hours of the watch. They learned each other's habits and preferences, quirks and annoyances, the small behaviors that could be endearing or infuriating, depending on the mood of the observer. They knew how each man took his tea, which topics of conversation were safe and which were dangerous, how much silence each could tolerate before needing to speak. Thomas had served with men he liked and men he despised. He had shared the tower with a principal keeper named Morrison, who told the same stories over and over, word for word, as if he had forgotten telling them, until Thomas could recite them from memory and had to physically restrain himself from finishing Morrison's sentences. He had worked with an assistant keeper named Davies, who chewed his food with his mouth open, a small thing, a trivial thing, but a thing that grew larger with each meal, until Thomas found himself eating in a different room, just to escape the sound. He had also known moments of genuine connection, of friendship forged in the isolation that would have been impossible in ordinary life. One winter, during a storm that lasted 3 days, Thomas and his colleagues had huddled together in the service room, talking through the night to stay awake, sharing stories they had never told anyone, confessing fears and regrets and hopes that seemed too fragile for the daylight world. By the time the storm passed, they knew each other as brothers, bound by experiences that no outsider could understand. These bonds were temporary. The rotation ensured that the composition of the crew changed regularly, preventing any single relationship from developing too far in either direction. A man you had grown to love might be transferred to another station. A man you could barely tolerate might appear on the next relief boat to take his place. The lighthouse demanded flexibility, the ability to adapt to whoever fate and the service sent your way. The mail arrived with the supply ship, which meant that letters came in bundles, weeks of correspondence landing all at once, like dispatches from a foreign country. Thomas would carry his letters to his bunk and open them in order by postmark, reading them slowly, savoring each word, trying to reconstruct the days they described from the fragments of information they contained. His wife, Ellen, wrote faithfully, once a week, filling pages with news of their children, their village, the small dramas of domestic life. The baby had cut her first tooth. The older boy had started school and hated it. The garden had produced an unusual abundance of turnips. Mrs. Henderson down the lane had died peacefully in her sleep, and the funeral had been well attended. These details, which would have been ordinary in ordinary circumstances, became precious in the lighthouse, proof that life continued in his absence, that there was a world beyond the rock that remembered him and would welcome him back. Writing back was harder. What could he say about days that were identical to each other, about a routine that never varied, about storms that Ellen would only worry about if he described them? He fell into the habit of writing brief, reassuring letters, full of generalities and empty of specifics. All is well here. The light burns bright. I think of you often. I will be home soon. These phrases became formulas, repeated in letter after letter, saying nothing and everything at the same time. The gap between his life and Ellen's grew wider with each month of separation. She was raising their children, managing their household, making decisions without him. He was tending a light, keeping a log, existing in a suspended state where time moved differently than it did on shore. When they reunited during his shore months, there was always a period of adjustment, of learning each other again, of bridging the distance that had opened between them. Sometimes the bridge held. Sometimes it did not. Thomas knew keepers whose marriages had failed, whose wives had grown tired of waiting, whose children had grown up as strangers. He knew keepers who had retreated entirely into the lighthouse life, abandoning the shore, spending their leaves at the depot rather than going home to families who no longer felt like families. He knew keepers who had found other families on the rock, bonds with fellow keepers that replaced the bonds with wives and children, a substitution that the service neither encouraged nor acknowledged. He clung to his letters as proof that he was still connected, still part of something larger than the lighthouse. He kept them in a box under his bunk, tied with string, a collection that grew with each visit from the supply ship. On nights when the loneliness pressed too hard, he would take out the letters and read them again, hearing Ellen's voice in the words, seeing his children's faces in the descriptions of their doings. The letters were thin comfort, but they were comfort nonetheless, and in the lighthouse, you learned to be grateful for whatever comfort you could find. The lighthouse service did not speak openly about madness, but it was present in the official records, coded in euphemisms and clinical language. A keeper might be listed as relieved for medical reasons, or suffering from nervous exhaustion, or unable to continue duties. Behind these phrases lay the reality. Men who had broken under the strain of isolation, whose minds had turned against them in the silence and the darkness, who had to be removed from the rock before they harmed themselves or others. Thomas witnessed such a breakdown once, in his 3rd year of service. The assistant keeper was a young man named William Holt, recently married, inexperienced in the ways of the rock. He had seemed stable enough at first, quiet but capable, learning his duties with reasonable speed, adapting to the routine. But as the weeks passed, Thomas noticed changes. Holt began talking to himself, low mutters that continued even when others were present. He stopped eating properly, picking at his food, losing weight that his slender frame could not afford to lose. He developed a habit of checking the same things over and over, the same locks, the same windows, as if he could not trust his own memory. A principal keeper at the time, a man named Thompson, tried to address the situation. He spoke to Holt privately, offered reassurance, adjusted the watch schedule to give the young man more rest. But the decline continued. Holt began seeing things that were not there, ships on the horizon that no one else could see, figures moving on the rocks below. He became convinced that the lighthouse was haunted, that the spirits of drowned sailors had come to claim him. He refused to go to the lantern room alone, claiming that something waited for him there, something with empty eyes and reaching hands. The crisis came on a night of moderate weather, nothing that should have caused alarm. Thomas was asleep in his bunk when he was awakened by shouting. He found Holt in the service room, wielding a knife, screaming at shadows, convinced that enemies were closing in on him from every direction. Thompson was trying to talk him down, his voice calm and steady, but Holt was beyond reaching. It took both Thomas and Thompson to disarm him, to pin him to the floor, to hold him there while he sobbed and struggled and called out for help that could not come. They kept Holt restrained for 2 days, taking turns watching him, feeding him by hand when he would eat, speaking to him gently when he would listen. The supply ship was not due for another week, and there was no way to summon it early. They did what they could, and what they could was not much. When the ship finally arrived, Holt was taken aboard, still restrained, still muttering about the spirits in the light. Thomas never learned what happened to him afterward. The service did not share such information with the keepers who remained. This experience taught Thomas something important about the lighthouse life, that the threat was not only external, not only storms and waves, and the physical dangers of the rock. The threat was also internal, carried within each man, a potential for collapse that lay dormant until the right combination of circumstances brought it to the surface. The isolation, the monotony, the constant sound of the sea, the absence of the normal markers of human existence, all of these worked on the mind in ways that were invisible until they became catastrophic. The keepers developed their own methods for maintaining mental stability, strategies passed down from senior men to juniors, accumulated wisdom about how to survive in a place that seemed designed to drive men mad. Some of these strategies were sanctioned by the service. Others were personal, idiosyncratic, the private rituals that each man developed through trial and error. Routine was the foundation. The lighthouse already imposed a rigid schedule, but experienced keepers went further, structuring every hour of the day with specific activities. Morning was for maintenance, afternoon for reading or crafts, evening for chess or cards. The schedule was followed even when there was no external reason for it, even when the weather was too rough to work outside, even when all the maintenance had been completed. The schedule was not about efficiency. It was about sanity. It gave the day shape, prevented the drift into formlessness that could swallow a man whole. Hobbies were essential. Thomas carved. He had learned the basics of whittling as a boy and had refined his skills during his years on the rock. He carved birds, mostly, seabirds in flight or at rest, capturing in wood the creatures he watched through the lantern room windows. He carved slowly, deliberately, spending hours on a single feather, a single curve of wing. The work occupied his hands and focused his mind, keeping both away from the dangerous emptiness that waited at the edges of consciousness. Other keepers had their own pursuits. One man, Thomas knew, built ships and bottles, intricate miniatures that required steady hands and endless patience. Another wrote poetry, filling notebook after notebook with verses about the sea and the light and the loneliness. Another taught himself Latin from a grammar book, declining nouns and conjugating verbs as if you were preparing for an examination that would never come. These hobbies were not trivial. They were the lifelines that kept men connected to their own humanity. Reading was perhaps the most common escape. The lighthouse maintained a small library, books left by previous keepers and added to by Trinity House, a collection that ranged from classics to adventure stories to devotional texts. Thomas read voraciously during his years on the rock, working through authors he would never have encountered in ordinary life. He read Dickens and Scott, Thackeray and Collins, the Bible, and the works of the Church Fathers. The books transported him out of the tower into worlds where things happened, where time moved, where people spoke and laughed and wept. For the hours he spent reading, he was not alone. Physical exercise was harder to come by, but equally important. The tower's spiral staircase offered a kind of exercise, and some keepers made a practice of climbing it many times a day, up and down, counting the steps, measuring their fitness against their previous performances. On calm days, the gallery offered space for walking, A circular path around the lantern room where a man could pace for hours, looking out at the sea, feeling the wind on his face, reminding his body that it was still capable of movement, even if the movements went nowhere. And then there was prayer. Many keepers were religious men, their faith either predating their service or developed during it as a response to the enormity of the sea and the smallness of human life. Thomas prayed each morning and each evening. Brief prayers that asked for nothing, but expressed gratitude for survival and hope for continued protection. The prayers were a form of conversation, a dialogue with a presence that transcended the isolation, that listened even when no human ears could hear. Whether God existed or not, whether the prayers were answered or not, the act of praying was itself a comfort, a structure that gave meaning to days that might otherwise have had none. Asterisk, asterisk. The relief boat appeared on the horizon like a vision from another world. Thomas would spot it first as a smudge of smoke, barely visible against the gray sky, and his heart would lift in a way he could never quite explain. Over the following hours, the smudge would become a shape. The shape would become a vessel, and the vessel would grow larger and larger until it was anchoring in the lee of the rock, its crew waving to the keepers who waited on the landing platform. The relief brought everything: supplies for the lighthouse, letters from home, newspapers from the mainland, relief keepers to replace those whose rotation had ended. But more than any physical cargo, the relief brought connection. For a few hours, the keepers would interact with people from outside, would hear voices they had not heard before, would learn news that had not yet reached their isolated tower. The crew of the relief boat became the keepers' link to civilization. Their ambassadors from the world of pubs and streets and family dinners, Thomas always found the first moments of contact overwhelming. After weeks or months of the same three voices, the presence of new people was almost too much to process. He would stand on the landing platform, helping to unload the supplies, and would find himself staring at the faces of the crew, marveling at their strangeness, their newness, the simple fact of their existence. He would hear them talking and would have to concentrate to follow their words, as if they were speaking a foreign language rather than the English he had spoken his whole life. The crew of the relief boat knew what the keepers were experiencing. Many of them had served as lighthouse keepers themselves before taking positions on the tenders. They would bring small gifts beyond the official supplies: tobacco, sweets, newspapers, anything they thought the keepers might appreciate. They would share gossip and news, speaking quickly and continuously, understanding that their time at the rock was limited and that everything they said would be treasured and repeated for weeks afterward. The departure of the relief boat was always painful. Thomas would stand on the gallery, watching the vessel steam away toward the mainland, growing smaller against the horizon until it disappeared into the distance or the haze. The silence that followed was more profound than any silence before the boat arrived. The voices were gone. The connection was broken. He was alone again, or nearly alone, with his colleagues and his duties, and the endless rhythm of the sea. Not all visitors came by design. The sea sometimes delivered people to the lighthouse. Survivors of shipwrecks or accidents, clinging to debris or crowded into damaged boats, seeking shelter at the only structure they could see. These arrivals transformed the lighthouse from a place of routine into a place of crisis, challenging the keepers to respond to situations for which their training had only partially prepared them. Thomas remembered one. such arrival with particular clarity. It was a November night, cold and wet, the sea running high, but not dangerously so. He was on watch in the service room when he heard a sound that did not belong to the usual chorus of wind and wave. It was a human sound, a cry for help, barely audible above the noise of the weather. He grabbed a lantern and made his way to the gallery, peering down at the rocks below, trying to locate the source of the cry dot in the beam of his lantern. He saw a boat, a small fishing vessel, broken and foundering in the surge. Clinging to its remains were 3 men, their faces white with cold and terror, their hands gripping the splintered wood with the desperation of those who know they are about to die. Thomas shouted to his colleagues, and within minutes all 3 keepers were at the landing platform, throwing lines to the men in the water, hauling them up the slippery rocks, dragging them into the shelter of the tower. The fishermen were near death from exposure. The keepers stripped off their wet clothes, wrapped them in blankets, laid them near the stove in the kitchen, fed them hot tea and broth. Thomas worked through the night, watching over the men, adding coal to the fire, checking their breathing and their pulses. By morning, all 3 were conscious, able to speak, able to express their gratitude in words that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. The fishermen stayed at the lighthouse for 5 days, waiting for the weather to improve enough for them to be evacuated. During those 5 days, the dynamics of the tower changed completely. There were 6 men instead of 3, sharing space that was barely adequate for its normal occupants. There were stories to be told, experiences to be compared, connections to be made across the divide between keepers and fishermen, between those who lived on the sea and those who watched it from the rock. When the fishermen finally departed, ferried to the mainland by a vessel dispatched by the Coast Guard, Thomas felt their absence like a loss. For 5 days, he had been part of something larger than the lighthouse routine. He had saved lives, had formed friendships, had been reminded that his existence on the rock had value beyond the keeping of the light. Then they were gone, and he was back to the routine, and the memories of those 5 days became another thing to hold against the loneliness. The night watch was the longest part of a lighthouse keeper's day, a stretch of hours between midnight and sunrise, when the rest of the world slept and only the keeper was awake, tending the light, watching the sea, alone with his thoughts in the dim glow of the lantern room. This was the time when the isolation pressed hardest, when the silence was most complete, when the mind was most likely to wander into places best left unexplored. Thomas developed rituals for the night watch, small acts that helped him stay awake and focused during the long hours. He would make himself a cup of tea at midnight, at 2, at 4, the process of boiling water and steeping leaves providing a break in the monotony. He would pace the gallery, even in cold weather, the shock of the wind helping to clear his head. He would recite poems from memory, passages from the Bible, the lyrics of hymns he had learned as a child. The words filled the silence, gave his mind something to do, kept the dangerous thoughts at bay. The lantern room became a kind of sanctuary during these watches. The light at the center, burning steadily, cast a warm glow that softened the darkness beyond the windows. The lens, turning slowly, sent its beams sweeping out over the water like a searching eye. The mechanism ticked and whirred, a heartbeat in the silence, a reminder that the lighthouse was alive, that it had a purpose, that Thomas's presence there was meaningful, even if no ship came in sight. Throughout the night, He would often lose track of time during the night watch, entering a state that was neither quite waking nor sleeping, a trance induced by the rhythm of the light and the sound of the sea. Minutes would stretch into what felt like hours, and hours would compress into what felt like minutes. He would check his pocket watch and be surprised to find that more time had passed than he realized, or less. The normal rules of duration suspended in this space between the dark water and the dark sky. Sometimes, in this state, he would see things that might or might not have been real. Lights on the water that could have been ships or could have been reflections of stars. Movements in the darkness that could have been birds or could have been nothing at all. Once, he was convinced, he saw another lighthouse, its beam sweeping in counterpoint to his own, in a location where he knew no lighthouse existed. He watched it for perhaps an hour before it faded, and he never knew whether it had been a trick of fog and light or a hallucination produced by fatigue and solitude. The end of the night watch was always a relief, but it was a relief tinged with exhaustion. Thomas would make his final entries in the log, extinguish the lamp as the sun rose above the horizon, hand over his duties to the next keeper, and retire to his bunk. Sleep came quickly but fitfully, interrupted by dreams that were often indistinguishable from the waking hours he had just left behind. He would dream of the light, of the sea, of the endless turning of the lens, and would wake without being sure whether he had slept at all. Hush, hush, the thoughts that came unbidden in the silence of the night watch. Thoughts came that Thomas could not control. They rose from some deep place within him, carrying memories and fears and longings that he normally kept suppressed. He would find himself thinking of his childhood, of his mother who had died when he was young, of his father who had raised him with stern kindness. He would think of Ellen, of the warmth of her beside him in bed, of the sound of her voice calling him to dinner. He would think of his children, growing up without him, learning to walk and talk and read while he sat in a tower on a rock in the middle of the sea. He would think of death. This was unavoidable for anyone who lived with the sea, who watched its moods and knew its power, who understood that the line between survival and drowning was often merely luck. Thomas had seen bodies pulled from the water, had helped carry them to the relief boat, had watched the faces of the crew as they handled the dead with the careful detachment of those accustomed to mortality. He knew that his own body could one day be among those recovered, that the sea could take him as easily as it had taken so many others. The thought did not frighten him as much as he expected. After years on the rock, after countless storms survived and countless nights endured, death had become familiar, not an enemy, but a constant companion. He did not seek it, did not welcome it, but he no longer ran from it in his mind. If it came, it would come, and he would meet it with the same steady attention he brought to every other aspect of his lighthouse life. This acceptance was itself a kind of madness, perhaps, a resignation that would have seemed unhealthy to anyone living in the ordinary world. But the lighthouse was not the ordinary world, and the rules that applied there did not apply here. He would also think of the ships that passed in the night, their running lights visible for a few minutes before they disappeared over the horizon. Who were the people aboard those vessels? Where were they going? What were their stories? Thomas would imagine captains on their bridges, sailors in their bunks, passengers dreaming dreams he would never know. The ships were proof that the world continued, that people moved through it on their own journeys. That life existed beyond the rock, even if he could not reach it. The ships were company of a sort, silent visitors who asked nothing and gave nothing but the comfort of their presence. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, Thomas would think of nothing at all. His mind would empty, becoming as still as the sea on a windless day. In these moments, he was not Thomas Griffiths, lighthouse keeper, husband, father. He was simply a consciousness, existing in a moment, watching the light turn and the stars wheel overhead. The past and the future fell away, leaving only the present, only the now, only the simple fact of being alive in a tower on a rock in the middle of the sea. These were the moments he treasured most, though he could never have explained why, and they came only rarely. Gifts from the silence that asked to be received in silence. Asterisk, asterisk, the lighthouse had no trees to mark the seasons, no flowers to bloom in spring or leaves to fall in autumn. The rock was bare, scoured by wind and wave, inhospitable to any plant life beyond the lichens that clung to its crevices. And yet the seasons came, as they came everywhere, bringing their changes to the isolated tower and the men who lived within it. Spring was a season of returning light. The days lengthened, the darkness receding by minutes each day, until the keepers could see the sun set after their evening meal and rise before their morning tea. The sea calmed, the winter storms fading into memory, replaced by gentler swells that rocked the lighthouse without threatening it. The birds returned to the rocks in greater numbers, their calls filling the air with life, their courtship rituals playing out on ledges and in crevices where Thomas could watch from the gallery. Spring was hope, the promise that another winter had been survived, that warmth was coming, even if it never fully arrived on the rock-dot summer brought fog. This was the great irony of the lighthouse calendar, that the season of warmth and calm was also the season when the light was most often obscured, when the fog signal ran for days on end, when the keepers worked themselves to exhaustion, keeping the sound going through endless gray murk. The fog transformed the lighthouse into an island within an island, a world reduced to the few yards of rock visible from the windows. Thomas would climb to the gallery and see nothing but white, a blankness so complete that he could forget there was anything beyond it at all. But summer also brought the supply ships more frequently, brought longer periods of daylight in which to perform maintenance, brought nights that were short and watches that were easier to endure. Summer was the season of visitors, of relief boats that arrived on schedule, of occasional inspection tours by officials from Trinity House, who climbed the spiral stairs and examined the logbooks and pronounced themselves satisfied with the keeper's work. Summer was the closest thing to normalcy the lighthouse ever offered. Asterisk, asterisk, autumn was a season of preparation. The keepers knew what was coming, and they spent the mild days of September and October getting ready. Extra stores were laid in, the equipment was checked and repaired, the tower was painted and sealed against the weather to come. There was a sense of urgency to this work, a knowledge that the window of good weather was closing, that every day of calm was one fewer day before the storms arrived. Thomas would work long hours during autumn, driving himself to complete tasks that would be impossible once the seas turned violent. And then winter, a season that defined the lighthouse life. Winter was darkness, the sun rising late and setting early, the night stretching from 4 in the afternoon until 8 in the morning. Winter was storms, the great Atlantic gales that battered the tower and shook the keepers in their bunks. Winter was isolation, the supply ships unable to reach the rock for weeks at a time, the keepers thrown back entirely on their own resources. Winter was the test, the challenge that separated those who could survive the lighthouse from those who could not. Thomas had learned to see beauty in each season, even winter. There was beauty in the way the waves crashed against the tower, in the patterns of foam that the wind created on the water's surface, in the stark contrast between the white of the spray and the dark gray of the sky. There was beauty in the nights, when the stars burned with an intensity that could never be seen from land, when the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, when the northern lights sometimes appeared on the horizon, curtains of green and purple that danced for hours before fading into the dark. The holidays were the hardest time to be on the lighthouse, and Christmas was the hardest of all. Across Britain, families were gathering, children were opening presents, churches were full of carollers and candlelight. On the rock, 3 men sat in their circular rooms, eating a special meal prepared from stored provisions, toasting absent loved ones with a measured ration of spirits, trying to mark the day in some way that acknowledged its significance without succumbing to the sorrow of separation. The lighthouse service understood the difficulty of holiday duty and made small provisions for it. The supply ship that arrived in December would carry Christmas parcels from families, packages of food and gifts sent from home to brighten the keeper celebrations. There would be plum pudding, perhaps, or a cake carefully wrapped against the sea air. There would be letters longer and warmer than usual, filled with descriptions of family gatherings and expressions of love across the distance. These parcels were treasured, opened slowly on Christmas morning, each item examined and appreciated, and saved for the days of ordinary routine that would follow. Thomas tried to make Christmas special for his colleagues, as they tried to make it special for him. They would decorate the kitchen with whatever came to hand, bits of rope twisted into shapes, paper cutouts, anything that broke the monotony of the gray stone walls. They would prepare the best meal their stores allowed, perhaps a piece of salt beef that had been saved for the occasion, vegetables from the last of the autumn supply, the plum pudding steaming in its cloth. They would tell stories and sing carols, their voices rough from disuse but earnest in their effort. And yet, despite all efforts, Christmas on the Rock was a melancholy affair. The festivity only highlighted the absence of family, the distance from the celebrations that others were enjoying. Thomas would think of Ellen and the children. Would? Imagine them gathered around a fire he could not see, opening presents he had sent weeks before, eating a dinner he could not share. The thought was sweet and bitter at once, a reminder of what he had and what he was missing, of the price he paid for his service to the light. The light burned on Christmas night as it burned every night. The ships at sea did not stop for the holiday, and the lighthouse could not stop either. Thomas would take his watch in the lantern room, tending the flame while the rest of the world celebrated, and he would find in that duty a kind of consolation. He was not merely missing Christmas. He was working, serving, keeping the light burning for the sailors who were also away from their families on this night. He was part of a brotherhood of the absent, men scattered across the seas, united by their distance from home. The years accumulated slowly, each one indistinguishable from the one before, until Thomas looked up one day and realized that he had been a lighthouse keeper for more than 2 decades. The young man who had stepped onto the rock in 1847 was gone, replaced by a man with gray in his hair and lines on his face, a man whose joints ached in the cold and whose eyes strained in the dim light of the lantern room. The lighthouse had aged him, or perhaps it had simply allowed him to age, the years passing without the landmarks that might have made their passage noticeable. He had risen through the ranks, as men did who survived and performed their duties well. He was now a principal keeper, responsible for his own lighthouse, commander of his own small crew. The promotion had brought a modest increase in salary, and a corresponding increase in responsibility, but the essential nature of his work remained unchanged. He still tended the light, still kept the log, still watched the sea from the gallery as the storms came and went. The hierarchy of the lighthouse service was a formality, overlaid on a sameness that never varied. His children had grown in his absence. His son, whom he had last seen as a boy of 8, was now a man with a wife of his own, working as a clerk in Plymouth. His daughter had married a fisherman from the village, and had given him grandchildren he had met only a handful of times. Ellen's letters brought news of these lives, but the news was always second-hand, events described rather than experienced, a family existing at a remove that could never quite be closed. Ellen herself had changed in ways the letters did not capture. During his shore months, Thomas would see it, the way she had learned to live without him, the routines she had developed that did not include his presence, the decisions she made without consulting him, because consultation was impossible. They were still married, still loved each other in the way that long-married couples love, but the marriage had become something different from what it had been in their youth. It was a marriage of letters and brief reunions, of memories shared, and futures separate, of two lives that ran parallel without often intersecting. Thomas accepted this as he accepted everything about the lighthouse life. He had made his choice years ago, and the choice had consequences that unfolded over time. He could not undo what had been done, could not reclaim the years spent on the rock, could not become the husband and father he might have been in a different life. He could only continue doing his duty, keeping the light, waiting for the day when his service would end, and he could return to the shore for good. The lighthouse took its toll on the body as well as the mind. The constant climbing of the spiral staircase wore at the knees and hips. The cold and damp of winter seeped into the joints, producing aches that never quite went away. The handling of heavy equipment, the hauling of supplies, the endless maintenance, all of these left their marks on muscles and bones. Thomas was not yet old, but he felt old, his body carrying the accumulated strain of decades of service. His eyes had suffered from years of watching the light, of peering through fog, of straining to see ships on distant horizons. He needed spectacles now for reading, a concession to age that he resisted for years before finally accepting. The spectacles made the logbook easier to read, the mechanisms of the light easier to adjust, but they were also a reminder of his diminishing capacities, evidence that the work he had done for so long was becoming harder with each passing year. His hearing had changed too, though in ways that were harder to define. He could still hear the fog signal, the crash of the waves, the cry of the gulls. But there was a buzzing beneath all sounds, a remnant of years spent near the machinery of the light and the roar of the signal. The buzzing was always there, even in silence, a companion he had not asked for, but could not dismiss. The younger keepers treated Thomas with respect that bordered on reverence. He was a survivor, one of the old guard who had served through decades of storms and isolation. He knew things that could not be learned from manuals, tricks of the trade that he had developed through experience and passed on to those who came after him. When problems arose that the manuals did not address, the younger keepers came to Thomas, and he would think for a moment, drawing on memories of similar problems in the past, and would offer solutions that usually worked. But Thomas also knew that his time was running out. The lighthouse service had policies about age and fitness, and sooner or later, those policies would catch up with him. He would be retired, pensioned off, sent to live out his remaining years on the shore he had left so long ago. The prospect was both welcome and terrifying. Welcome because he was tired, because his body ached, because the thought of another winter on the rock filled him with dread. Terrifying because the lighthouse had become his life, because he longer knew who was apart from it, because the shore had become as foreign to him as the rock had once been. Asterisk, asterisk, in the winter of 1871, when Thomas was 56 years old and had served the lighthouse service for 24 years, a storm came that would be remembered for generations. It built slowly, the barometer dropping over 3 days, the sea rising by degrees, the wind shifting from quarter to quarter, as if searching for the angle of maximum destruction. The keepers watched its approach with the experienced eyes of men who had seen many storms, and they knew that this one would be different. They prepared as they always prepared, securing everything that could be secured, checking and rechecking the integrity of the tower. Thomas inspected the lens one final time, ensuring that every prism was in place, every fitting tight. He filled the oil reservoirs to their maximum capacity, trimmed the wicks to perfect length, wound the mechanism that would turn the lens through the night. If the storm were to take him, it would find him at his post, doing his duty to the last. The storm struck at nightfall, its full fury unleashed in a matter of hours. The wind reached velocities that Thomas had never experienced, screaming around the tower with a sound like the end of the world. The waves rose to heights that seemed impossible, mountains of water that climbed the granite walls and crashed against the lantern room windows with enough force to crack the thick glass. The tower shook with each impact, the vibrations running through the stone and into the bones of the keepers. Thomas was in the lantern room when the largest wave struck. He felt the tower lurch, felt the floor tilt beneath his feet, heard a sound of rending stone that he had never heard before. For a moment, he was certain that the lighthouse was going to fall, that the rock that had held it for decades was finally giving way, that he and his colleagues and the light they tended were about to be swept into the sea. He grabbed the railing around the lens and held on, waiting for the end. The end did not come. The tower settled back to vertical. The shaking subsided. The roar of the wave faded into the general roar of the storm. Thomas looked around the lantern room and saw that the light was still burning, the lens still turning, the beams still sweeping out over the chaos below. He checked himself for injury and found none. He checked the equipment and found it intact. He resumed his watch, because that was what lighthouse keepers did, and the storm continued through the night. By morning, the worst had passed. The wind was still strong, the sea still rough, but the violence of the night was over. Thomas climbed to the gallery to survey the damage, and what he saw took his breath away. A section of the tower's base had been stripped of its outer layer of stone, exposing the core beneath. The landing platform had been torn away entirely, leaving only twisted metal where it had once stood. Debris littered the rocks, pieces of equipment that had been secured, but not secured enough. Remnants of things that had been part of the lighthouse's routine, for as long as Thomas could remember, that the tower stood. The light had burned through the night. The duty had been done. Thomas looked out at the gray morning, at the sea that was slowly calming, at the horizon where the storm had gone, and he felt something that might have been pride, or might have been exhaustion, or might have been both. He had survived another storm, perhaps the last storm he would ever face on this rock. The lighthouse had held, and he had held with it. 3 months later, Thomas received the letter he had been expecting for years. The lighthouse service, in recognition of his long and faithful service, was offering him retirement. His pension would be adequate, his housing arranged, his future secured. All he had to do was leave the rock, leave the lighthouse, leave the life he had known for nearly a quarter of a century. He read the letter in the kitchen, while his colleagues ate their morning porridge and pretended not to watch. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. The words were formal, bureaucratic, devoid of any acknowledgment of what they meant. They were ending his career, his purpose, his reason for existence. And they were doing so with the detached efficiency of an organization that had already moved on to the next keeper, the next posting, the next storm. The final weeks passed slowly. Each day waited with the knowledge that it was one of the last. Thomas found himself paying attention to things he had long since stopped noticing. The particular shade of gray the sea took on at twilight, the way the light reflected off the lens at certain angles, the sound of his footsteps on the iron stairs. He was cataloging memories, storing them against the time when they would be all he had left of this place. On his last night, he took the watch alone. His colleagues understood, without anything being said, that this was something he needed to do. He climbed to the lantern room as the sun set, lit the lamp, set the mechanism in motion, and took his place by the window. The sea was calm, the sky clear, the stars emerging one by one as the darkness deepened. It was a beautiful night, the kind of night that reminded him why he had become a lighthouse keeper, why he had stayed so long, why part of him did not want to leave. He watched the light turn, counting the revolutions as he had counted them countless times before. He watched the beam sweep over the water, touching the waves with its glow, reaching out to ships he could not see. He thought of all the nights he had spent in this room, all the storms weathered, all the silences endured. He thought of the men he had served with, the ones who had survived and the ones who had not. He thought of Ellen, waiting for him on the shore, and of the life that awaited him there, a life without the light, without the sea, without the steady rhythm that had ordered his existence for so long. When morning came, Thomas extinguished the lamp for the last time. He climbed down from the lantern room, packed his few possessions into the same wooden trunk that had carried them to the rock 24 years before, and waited on the gallery for the relief boat to arrive. The boat appeared on the horizon just after 8, growing larger as it approached, bringing the keeper who would take his place, the stranger who would inherit his duties and his solitude. The transfer was quick and businesslike, as all such transfers were. Thomas shook hands with his colleagues, accepted their well wishes, climbed down the ladder to the boat. He did not look back as the boat pulled away from the rock. He did not watch the lighthouse grow smaller on the horizon. He kept his eyes fixed on the shore ahead, on the land that was becoming visible through the morning haze, on the future that awaited him there. Behind him, the light that had been his life for so long continued its silent revolution. Tended now by other hands, burning for ships he would never see. Thomas Griffiths lived another 12 years after leaving the lighthouse service. He settled in a small cottage in the village where Ellen had waited for him through all those years of absence, and he tried to learn what it meant to live on solid ground. The adjustment was harder than he had expected. He missed the rhythm of the watch, the sound of the sea, the simple clarity of a life devoted to a single purpose. He would wake in the night and reach for duties that were no longer his, would climb stairs that led nowhere, would listen for the ticking of mechanisms that have long since fallen silent. But gradually, slowly, he found a new equilibrium. He tended a garden, the first garden he had ever had, and found satisfaction in watching things grow from the earth. He walked along the cliffs above the sea, looking out at the water that had been his home, remembering the storms and the silences. He told stories to his grandchildren about life on the rock, stories that seemed fantastical to young ears, tales of a world that was already disappearing as technology changed and the old ways gave way to the new. He and Ellen had time together at last, time to rebuild the marriage that had survived despite the distance, time to learn each other again as the people they had become rather than the people they had been when they were young. They would sit together in the evenings, watching the sunset from their cottage window, not speaking because they had learned that silence could be comfortable, that the presence of another person was sometimes enough without words to fill it. On clear nights, Thomas could see the lighthouse from the cliffs above the village. Its beam would sweep across the sky at regular intervals, a rhythm he knew as well as his own heartbeat. He would stand there, watching the light turn, and he would feel a connection that distance could not break. He had given his best years to that tower, had sacrificed things that could never be recovered, had endured privations that few people would ever understand. And in return, he had received something that he could not name, but that he carried with him always. A knowledge of himself, of what he was capable of the depths to which solitude could take a man, and the heights from which he could still return. Thomas Griffiths died in 1883, peacefully in his sleep, with Ellen beside him and the sound of the sea audible through the open window. He was buried in the village churchyard, in a plot that faced the ocean, and his headstone bore a simple inscription, "Keeper of the Light." It was all that needed to be said. It was everything he had been. The lighthouse he had served was automated in 1982, more than a century after his death. The keepers were withdrawn, the living quarters sealed, the duties that Thomas had performed transferred to machines that required no company, no conversation, no human presence at all. The light still burns, powered now by electricity rather than oil, controlled by computers rather than clockwork, but burning still, sweeping the horizon, warning ships away from the rocks that claimed so many before the towers were built. And on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the waves crash against the ancient stone, some say that the lighthouse is not quite empty. Some say that if you listen closely, you can hear footsteps on the iron stairs, the ticking of the old mechanism, the quiet breathing of a man at his post. Some say that Thomas Griffiths never really left, that his spirit remains in the tower he served so long, keeping the watch, tending the flame, waiting for a relief that will never come. But that is just a story, told by those who find comfort in the thought that devotion outlasts death. The truth is simpler and perhaps more profound. Thomas Griffiths was a man who did his duty, who kept the light burning through darkness and storm, who gave his life to a purpose larger than himself. And in that giving, in that service, in that long and lonely vigil on a rock in the middle of the sea, he found something that most people never find. He found meaning. He found peace. And now, dear listener, as this story draws to its close, I hope you have found some peace as well. The night outside your window continues. The stars wheel overhead. The world turns on its axis as it has always turned. Whatever storms await you in the days ahead, whatever darkness you must navigate, remember the lighthouse keeper. Remember that patience and duty and simple endurance can see you through. Remember that even in the deepest isolation, there is purpose to be found. Sleep now. The light burns on. The keeper watches. All is well. Thank you for listening to The Night Archivist. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you listened from tonight. Until next time, sleep well.